Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. No World this week on this last Friday of the year. Instead, a show that we're calling The World in 2018. And joining us, Vivian Walt, correspondent for Time Magazine. How have you been?
Very good.
How was your 2017?
I'm a little glad it's over.
You're a little glad it's over. Still 2 more days to go. Also joining us, Thamaïs Papayannou, Paris correspondent for Greek public broadcaster ERT.
Hello.
We'll ask about your New Year's resolutions a little bit later on. Paul Moreira, who is the founder of Première Ligne Productions, the TV documentary filmmakers. You've got a few things on the front burner that we'll talk about in a moment, perhaps.
Absolutely.
And as well joining us, Craig Kapitas, editor-at-large, TRT World, the author of Metal Men. How are you?
Fine, mon capitaine. How are you doing?
Not so bad,
Good.
not so bad. The World in 2018, in partnership with the Daily Beast, your reactions and comments on the hashtag World This Week. Now, to ring in 2018, meet Zabivaka, the mascot for the Football World Cup in Russia, is not a bear. Instead, it's a wolf. And hopefully we'll see some images of Zabivaka in a moment. You'll be discovering, there he is, you'll be discovering a lot of Zabivaka come in a few months' time. Thamaïs, what do you think of Zabivaka?
He's ugly. But it can be cute. So yeah, why not? Well,
Are you disappointed it's a wolf and not a bear?
Actually, no, it's a good idea. It's not, it's against, I am against the stereotype, so it's good. A wolf. Russian wolf, yeah, why not?
All right, and by the way, just as the 2014 Winter Olympics put Sochi on the map, the World Cup will be the chance to discover everywhere from Kaliningrad in the west to Yekaterinburg east of the Ural Mountains. Oh, and to revisit Sochi once again. France kick off their opening match against Australia in Kazan. What will sports journalists find when they reach Kazan, Craig Kapitas?
Well, first of all, the best way to get there is basically you go to hell, you take a left, travel south to the third circle, take a right, and you're in Kazan.
No disrespect to those watching.
No, no disrespect at all. It's a wolfish little town. I'm sure everyone will have a grand old time.
It is interesting because this is not the Olympics, which all takes place in one venue. Here, is it going to be a problem for Russia having all these nosy reporters going around to all these places?
Not at all. I think that's the great myth of the World Cup, of all sporting events. The Olympics or the World Cup, all that political stuff that you want to cover, all the interesting stories, all of those take place running up to kickoff or when the flame is lit. Once the games begin, it's a sporting contest and nobody cares about anything else. You could look it up.
Vivian Walt?
Well, I think like one perfect kind of idiom, if you like, for this World Cup is that the US will not be there. And if there's anything that like captures Russia's maneuvering into, 2018 and, positing itself as the alternative to the US, the World Cup will be it.
Is that a good or a bad thing for Putin that the Americans won't be there?
I think it's probably a good thing. I think it's a way of him, claiming a kind of primacy, at least for a couple of weeks. And all the gold dust that you saw in that video, it's hard to tell whether it's a sort of gold flying out of the country or whether he's actually going to, make well out of it. It's I would say that's a very uncertain result.
Because that is the question, isn't it? We have this projection of strength on the part of the Russians, and is that strength just paper thin and gilded, or is it real?
I think like there's a very contradictory element here. I think in one hand, Putin wants to use this incredible soft power tool that the football soccer cup will be to be shown as a normal country, part of the nations, and the Russians really want that. And on the other hand, they have this kind of deep DNA of controlling. He's a control freak, Putin. So he'll have to cope with both energies, both dynamics. One of trying to give a smiling face, and the other keep controlling the dynamics of their society.
Of course, before the World Cup, there is that small technicality for Putin getting reelected to another 6-year term. Recently, at his annual marathon press conference, the Russian president fielded a question from a putative rival in that race, socialite turned journalist and activist Ksenia Sobchak.
In this country, being an opposition politician means you'll either be jailed, killed, or something similar. Why is this the case? Are authorities afraid of fair competition?
There should be and there will be competition at the election. But it's a matter of radicalism. What constitutes a democracy is a matter that's open to discussion. But rest assured, we're not afraid of anyone.
Some describe that as a bit of an awkward exchange. In fairness to Sobchak, she also asked in her long question about Alexei Navalny, and that's what Putin's referring to when he talks about radicalism. What do you make of that exchange? What do you make of this race that's coming up, this election race?
Well, obviously, Putin is not interested in democracy. It's a negative term for him. He uses it because he wants to show that Russia is a strong state. It's a confident, strong state, and he is a strong leader. And this is what matters most.
But it's not as clear cut as that, is it? Because he talks about managed democracy.
Exactly. It's a like modern state. He is going to initiate a new Russia. Well, let's say put it in the 21st century. We are a modern state. We are a world power. In Syria, they showed their capacity. So I think he's going to win, obviously. He needs opposition, obviously, because otherwise the rest of the world will say again, oh, it's all half dictatorship or something. But democracy for the Russians has not the same connotation, the same substance as in the West. And that's why he's navigating somehow between the very strong authoritative state and the idea of democracy, because he has to sell it to everybody inside his own people and outside, of course.
Craig Kapitas, his support is strongest among older people. What does that mean? He's going to be 65 when he's elected for another 6-year term. What are the pitfalls that await him now?
Well, his only pitfall is whether or not he can micromanage his successor. This is very key in a concept in Kremlinology, Putinology, call it what you will. Ksenia Sobchak is a family friend of Putin. She is the daughter of the former mayor of St. Petersburg, who gave Putin his first political chops after he left the KGB. Putin became president of Russia because Boris Yeltsin appointed him, but only after Putin signed a number of documents which essentially avoided the government going after Yeltsin for corruption. Whoever succeeds Putin is going to have to provide the same guarantees for him. That's how it works there. So he has to find that person who is going to be his successor and hopefully get out of town with his skin on and his money in the bank. That's what's going on there now.
It's going on right now, even though he hasn't been elected to that term.
That is correct, yes.
And so the jailing of his and the spectacular arrest of his economy minister, Alexei Ulyakov, that's the opening salvo of the dogfight that's about to begin?
Well, this is a very Russian thing. There has been a concept, it's perestroika. In Russian, it's called kazrashot. It means economic accountability. Perestroika was supposed to create economic accountability. Yeltsin promised it, and so did Putin. That hasn't been delivered on. So what has he done? He's taken one of his top dogs, and he's thrown him to that little wolf, who is now the mascot of the World Cup, thus keeping people happy, making the older people, as you pointed out, oh, look, Vladimir Vladimirovich is doing something for us. That's the political mechanic at play.
Paul Moreira, you're putting the finishing touches on a documentary that will air for the elections in March. What's your takeaway on this upcoming vote?
Well, my documentary is about Russian soft power, the way they use the social networks to influence Europe and specifically American elections, the way they try to utilize the strength of the National Front that they try
here in France.
In France, they tried to turn them into Russian agents. Really, I mean, we can prove now by the circuit of the money that was given. Lent to the National Front, that there was a very strong intent into turning them into a porte-voix,
spokesman,
a spokesperson for the interests of the Russians. So I'm interested. I was in this film interested in digging on those new methods that are very different.
And will those new methods apply in Russia? Because it's a delicate balancing act. Tomais was explaining it. He's got to win, of course, but not by too much, but not by too little.
I think that the propaganda in Russia and the impact of fake news and all that is much stronger than in Europe. Like if you watch RT or you read Sputnik feed, it's very difficult to find actually one fake news. But when you watch Russian TV, it's like, for example, the image they have of the West is like we are fighting with each other. There is a bombing every hour in the streets, and there are Islamists trying to cut our throats. And so I think it's much stronger in Russia because the counterpowers are lesser than for us in the West, where they know they're monitored and they're very careful about what they broadcast.
And it gets us back to the question of whether Putin is strong or weak going into 2018.
I think it's very mixed. I mean, as Tomais says, that he has emerged at the end of this year quite extraordinarily with Syria more or less intact. I mean, it was his biggest foreign policy move to keep Assad in power, and in that he has succeeded.
Yeah,
and he has beaten the West after 5 years. And I think that's actually highly significant.
Can I wait? Did he beat the West, or did Trump actually let him do it? Let it be your problem. We don't want to have anything to do with it. Let Russia have Syria. Let Russia have this mess.
I think it predates Trump in a way.
Obama.
And I think it began under Obama. It began with Obama's failure to move against Assad.
Failure, or is it more of Obama said, hey, I don't want to get bogged down in another conflict. Putin wants to go, fine, have it.
Well, you know, hindsight is 20/20, as they say. But it's, you know, back 4 years ago, one might have been able to drive out Assad. In 2018, it is highly unlikely.
All right, earlier this month, Putin paying a surprise visit to Russia's Hemiman air base in Syria. There he effectively declared victory and announced that there was a drawdown coming up, victory against ISIS. He also paid, during that same trip, calls on Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Egypt's Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. When you look at those images, Tomais Papayannou, does Putin have what it takes to know when not to overreach and overstretch himself in conflicts like
Oh,
this?
he was a master of the game in Syria, and obviously now he's scaling back the Russian presence there because he doesn't need any more of military presence. Now it's another game for him. It's political game, the peace process, the initiatives. Even Macron yesterday, on Sunday night, he said that we are not Assad departure is not a precondition anymore. Which was always the Russian position. So he won on everything, Putin, and he doesn't need to go up front right now. He is waiting for the peace process to begin, and I'm sure the Russians will stay in the region in Syria.
What's Vladimir Putin's vision of the Middle East? Like, how involved does he want to be?
I think Putin, I think Putin is I believe, or at least claim to believe, that he wants to take up the role of regional power broker that the U.S. used to have.
Because a year ago, what we were saying was that we were saying, oh yeah, when he's in the Middle East, think Ukraine. He's there simply to leverage in regards to Ukraine.
The U.S. a long time ago realized there was no mileage in getting bogged down in the Middle East. If it wasn't for Bush's Gulf War II in Iraq, it would be such a completely different playing field. That said, there's a larger issue to consider here. All Putin offers is weaponized rhetoric. He doesn't have any cash. The people who are applying politicized cash are the Chinese. They're going in, they're pouring money into Africa, they're doing deals in the Middle East, they're doing deals all over the place. What to look for, since we're prognosticating for 2018, is I think the most important thing to look at as far as Russia goes in 2018 is to see what kind of bilateral arrangements they make with China. That is going to be a key indicator, because Russia is broke. They don't have any money. China does, and they're spending it.
The Russia that you visited, was it broke?
Yeah, stick to this analysis. But I must say about Syria, because I was in Syria, I was in Raqqa.
And we'll talk more about it just after the break.
About Russia and Syria, and I think it's very interesting to notice, and I totally agree with you, that they are the master of the game. I mean, they have played very shrewdly. Like through Astana negotiations, they have managed to let the Turks come in and block the Kurds of Afrin, which is a small enclave of Kurds in the northwestern part of Syria. And at the same time, they have started to negotiate with the Kurds, with the YPG, which is basically the PKK, which is Öcalan, the worst enemies, the worst nightmare of the Turks. So basically they are doing what a great diplomatic power should be doing, is talking with both sides and cultivating relationship with both sides. And they're doing it, I must say, their objective is to control the area. It's obvious.
Their objective is to get in there.
It's obvious. And at the same time, they're helping the regime. So they're like playing three different actors in a very shrewd way.
All right, when we come back, we're going to take a look at just how the Middle East is doing as we go into the new year, a Middle East in flux. Stay with us. You're watching a special year-end edition of The World This Week.
Reporters Plus, presented by Mark Owen.
In the Western world, the life cycle of clothing shrinks with every passing year, down now to just a few months. We're dumping more and more in street corner containers. But what then becomes of those clothes? Our unprecedented report follows their incredible journey across Europe and Africa in order to understand the enormity of a business that generates more than 5 billion euros a year.
Reporters Plus on France 24 and France24.com.
Hello, it's 7:30 p.m. here in the French capital. I'm Belle Donati. Let's get you up to date with our headlines. Mali's Prime Minister and his cabinet resign without giving a reason, leaving the president to scramble to name a new government, the fifth in 4 years. Liberia's vice president concedes defeat in presidential elections, leaving the path clear for ex-footballer George Weah to take the presidency in what's set to be Liberia's first democratic transition since 1944. The Islamic State organisation has claimed responsibility for an attack on a Coptic church in Cairo, which left 10 people dead. It's the latest in a series of attacks on Egypt's Christian minority. Iranian police have dispersed anti-government protesters in the western city of Kermanshah. Demonstrations have spread to several other cities, including Tehran. They're protesting against rising prices and alleged corruption, as well as concerns over Iran's costly involvement in Syria and Iraq. You're up to date with our top stories. Well, now let's get you back to the debate.
Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us for a special year-end edition. We're calling it The World in 2018. We're in the company of Vivian Wald, correspondent for Time magazine, also Thomas Papagiannou, Paris correspondent for Greek public broadcaster ERT, Paul Moreira, founder of Première Ligne Productions, the documentary filmmakers, and we're also with Greg Kapitas, editor-at-large for TRT World, author of Metal Men. We were talking before the break about how Russia's in it for the long haul in the Middle East. And this, as well, the big difference going into 2018 is that ISIS is all but gone. And the question people have been wondering is, when you look back at the year past, who did the fighting? The fall of Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa, the so-called capital of the caliphate in Syria, were the result of a coalition of forces, although on the Syrian side, it was U.S.-backed Kurdish militias that did most of the fighting on the ground 4 years after the takeover of vast swathes of Iraq and Syria. We're now in a new phase for Iraq with its fragile federalism. We saw with that referendum on Kurdish independence that was rejected by Baghdad, and Syria with a civil war that is continuing. Civilians are continuing to die or starve in some instances. And also, we were talking about it just before the break, regional players that are recalibrating. Paul Moreira, you were in Raqqa when it fell.
Yes, I was in Raqqa on October 9th. We were actually frontline, and there was heavy fighting, firefighting. The Islamic State was not ready to give up arms, not at all. And all of a sudden, we got an order on the radios from the headquarters of the Kurdish militia. All journalists should withdraw, should be evacuated from Raqqa. So we were like forcibly evacuated. We had no choice but to hop in a Hummer and drive all the way to Kobane. And what happened is they negotiated with the Islamic State the end of the fight. I mean, I'm not judging morally, because a lot of people were dying, and I think it's a good thing to save lives to negotiate with them. But the bad side of the story is that 400 people, heavily armed, were able to escape Raqqa. And
where are those people now?
So there are various versions, and we don't exactly know. The guy from the BBC who did the story, I think it's Quentin Somerville, did the story about it, and he says, but that's only on one source, and I don't believe it, because it's really scary if it's true, that some of those guys, the European guys, have crossed the border into Turkey, and that they are ready to come back here and to perform terrorist attacks. But for me, the most realistic option is that they would go to Idlib, which is actually at the moment controlled by the Al-Qaeda, which is now the moderate Islamists, as we all know. And they would join forces with Al-Qaeda and go to the last battle would be Idlib, with already the Turks face. The Turks are near Idlib. It's getting complicated, and the regime should go closer to Idlib.
So now we're in this situation where ISIS is virtually gone.
It has disappeared as a caliphate.
Disappeared as a caliphate. The caliphate is gone. The part where there's the American influence, the part where the Russian influence sort of run into each other. And then you have this sort of what they call the Shia highway that can now stretch from Iran all the way to the border with Israel.
Exactly.
So does that mean is going to be more or less conflict in 2018?
Well, I believe that there's going to be slightly less, because the Free Syrian Army, that were the first rebels, that only independent rebels at the very beginning of the insurgency in 2011, are out of the game or controlled by the Turks. The only strong conflict possibility for me is between the Kurds and the Turks, because you have now a very strong and politically organized Kurdish force in the northeastern area of Syria. And the Turks are just obsessed with the idea that those guys could claim a Kurdish nation state at their very border. And they have now tanks and armed forces within the Syrian territory. So that could be the next conflict.
The next conflict, Tomás Papaioannou?
And in addition to that, the next conflict may be Libya, because some of the ISIS army are commuting somehow into Libya. And I think Libya is a dangerous place to be in the foreseeable future, honestly.
All right, so Syria could abate slightly, but the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran isn't going away. Where Saudi Arabia since June has a 32-year-old crown prince who's upset the form by purging potential rivals, summoning Lebanon's prime minister, blockading Qatar, bombing Yemen even more. Which way will it go for Mohammed bin Salman in the coming year? Greg Kapitas?
I don't think he's going to have a good year, even though he intends to open cinemas. You know, you made a list of things he did. He also spent $450 million on a Da Vinci painting, which might not be a Da Vinci painting, close to $350 million on a yacht, 300 and some million euros on some big fancy chateau right down the street from where, from where we are. The most dangerous thing he's done is he still has locked up the head of Kingdom Holdings, who is a fellow by the name of
Prince Walid.
Yes, excuse me, I had a little brain lock there. Now, he is the poster boy of everything Saudi Arabian on Wall Street and Hollywood and the West. And there have been reports that he has him strung upside down in that Ritz-Carlton in beautiful downtown Riyadh and is torturing him. And he will not turn his money over. This young princeling has a real problem, and that he is not going to do anything.
So is his big problem going to be Iran, or is his big problem going to be his own inner circle?
No, his problem is that he is not going to bring about any change that in any way will affect his own position. Welcome to Saudi Arabia.
Welcome to Saudi Arabia. Welcome to the Middle East. What's it going to mean for the Middle East?
Prince Mohammed bin Salman? Oh, well, I think he is going to have a major impact on. Well, he is already having a major impact on the region. And if you talk to people in the Gulf, as I have in the last couple of weeks, and I was in Saudi Arabia just last month, that there is a sense that his ascent to power, which it is already, and could well become a formal ascent to power in 2018, will actually have huge ripple effects across the region in many different ways. In the contest with Iran, of course, which is what dominates everything in Saudi Arabia, but also in the realignment of what Sunni Islam does, that you now have what effectively the custodian of the religion, as the Saudis like to think of themselves as, basically feeling that it's okay for women to drive and for movie theaters to open. I don't think we should underestimate the kind of message that this sends. It's not simply
But it's two tales, right? The people of Yemen are under the bombs.
Absolutely.
Look. It's about the money. Everything that's going on in Saudi Arabia right now hinges on the upcoming IPO of a certain percentage of Saudi Aramco, which everyone and their uncle in the West wants to have part of, which is why his friends didn't come to stand up for him when he was arrested. People like Bill Gates, the head of Citigroup, the head of Uber and Lyft. The list goes on and on and on and on. Iger, the head of Disney. Everyone wants a piece of that IPO. And the problem he's having with that IPO is that the due diligence required to issue an initial public offering on a Western exchange does not meet the standard that they do in Saudi Arabia. They're not transparent. So as he's been going to the global stock markets to look for an IPO, the regulators are saying, well, you've got to tell us this and you've got to tell us that. And the Saudis aren't telling them anything because Saudi Aramco is the personal piggy bank of the royal family. You could look it up.
Paul Moreira, one final point on this. What about this warming of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia? Is that going to continue despite...
The key word to answer that is Iran. I mean, Netanyahu is also so obsessed with Iranian influence that he's, of course, going to ally with the opposite force in the Islamic world, and it's the Sunnis of Saudi Arabia.
Limping into 2018, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Theresa May, who's been forced by Tory backbenchers to submit the Brexit process to greater parliamentary scrutiny. That's stealing some of the shine off of the painstaking deal on terms of divorce with the continent, one that will open the way to negotiations on the post-Brexit relationship between the UK and the EU. The way 2017 ended, Vivian Waltz, how's it going to go for her in 2018?
It is extraordinary that we've been talking about this for 18 months, and that it almost feels like the same conversation we were having the day after the referendum. And it is as if nothing has really happened yet. They've got until October to formalize a treaty to leave just, 7 months later, I believe.
March 19.
Right.
So how do Greeks take it? Because
it's exactly the same thing as the Greek negotiations with the Troika. Exactly the same process, exactly the same protocol, exactly the same PR propaganda. Everything is by the book. It's amazing how we can see. Every time I speak with the British, I tell them, don't worry, just read the previous press releases. You're going to guess what's coming up. I mean, it's exactly the same thing.
But do you feel as though, Greece is still teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Do you feel as though all the oxygen in the room has been sucked by the Brexit coverage?
No. The Greek issue is over for the time being.
For the time being.
But right now, it's the Brexit is a brilliant demonstration of the incapacity, the European capacity to lead something in good terms and. In the profit and the benefit of everybody. And as when the British will leave the EU, it will be chaos. They are leaving the EU in terrible state. And the Europeans don't understand that without the British, we are like amputated. We are invalid. It's like half our arm doesn't exist anymore. It's essential.
But there's there's a difference. There's a difference. You see,
and budget-wise.
And budget-wise. But there's a bigger cultural difference because the British are never so happy as when you tell them they're ruined, and that's what this is all about. You tell a Greek he's ruined, he's going to say no, we're not. And he's going to stand up. The Brits seem to love wallowing in this Brexit thing, which I always thought was ill-named. It has nothing to do about Great Britain. It's the English. If you look at the voting patterns, right? It's England that wanted out of this thing, not the people of Britain.
Well, they voted out in Wales as well. But that's the glass half empty that we've heard from this side of the room. But Paul Moreira, some are saying that actually it's the Irish that are saving Britain, because with this deal on a open border, they've effectively allowed London to save face and effectively, without any voting rights, kind of stay in the European Union without saying so.
Yeah, obviously there's going to be this and other arrangements so that, England doesn't become like a citadel of a closed citadel, but I take it seriously, the Brexit, because it could be the first step of something more grave. Because again, I've spent a lot of time listening to the National Front voters lately, and they say the same thing. I'm not talking about the technicalities of the links between England and Europe, but the perception of the people and why they voted for the Brexit was like, you have those guys from Poland coming, taking our jobs and being less paid than we are. And in France, you have this feeling hugely in some areas, and that's why there's a very important anti-European feeling among certain voters in France. And Macron said that he was going to implement some changes in...
Yeah, most notably with posted workers.
Exactly. It's an emergency. It's actually an emergency because really, I mean, we should take Brexit as something serious. It could be the first step of Europe falling apart.
2017 saw Africa's first ever annulment of a presidential election, but hopes that Kenya's democracy had come of age were to be dashed when the rerun would prove even more lackluster, with the opposition boycotting more deadly violence. Elsewhere on the continent, Zimbabwe heads into 2018 with the first time someone other than Robert Mugabe as its leader. Comrade Bob finally chased out at 93 when his own party decided to step in and stop his wife Grace from taking over. Will a nation once hailed as Southern Africa's breadbasket come alive in 2018, Vivian Walt?
Well, one shouldn't... It couldn't get much worse, put it that way. But you have a country that has more than 90% unemployment. The currency effectively is, has completely collapsed. There is almost no foreign currency that's come in to do anything about the crisis in mining, agriculture. This, as you say, used to be, the breadbasket of Africa. When you go to Zimbabwe, it's kind of staggering how lush and fertile it is. It feels like anything could grow there, and it did. And they will have to rebuild this country from scratch.
And they're not going to be able to. Allow me to put a number on that. Last year, there was only $295 million of foreign direct investment into Zimbabwe. Our young princeling we were speaking about, he spent $450 million on a Da Vinci. If you go to the Transparency International Corrupt Nation Index, there's 176 nations. Zimbabwe is 154 and dropping fast. I don't see how anyone, regardless of who the new president is or what they're promising, is going to pump in the kind of capital that's required.
Now, what's interesting is that Robert Mugabe's right-hand man, who's now taken over, his former head of security, he has made sort of conciliatory noises to bring back some of that foreign direct investment to the white farmers who were chased off their land. How is that going to go? Because this is one of those countries in Africa that did have a large white minority population and still does.
They have absolutely no choice. I mean, whether any white farmers will want to return to Zimbabwe is anyone's guess. I mean, their land was seized, their crops were effectively destroyed, they were run out of the country. I guess a few of them might want to come back, but it's going to take way more than that to get the agriculture back on track. And here you have, as you say, the right-hand man of Mugabe taken over. It's not like we've had democratic elections. Not sure that we will have democratic elections.
Look at China. That's where to go. Will that Russia-China axis we spoke about before start turning some of that weaponized rhetoric and Chinese hard currency towards Zimbabwe? Wall Street certainly isn't.
Well, certainly there was a lot of speculation when the Army Chief of Staff went to China a week before, perhaps not to plot, but certainly to get the green light before pushing Mugabe out. What does it mean, though, to have an Africa without Robert Mugabe as president? One of these who was a resistance movement hero and is still a hero to many. The further, analysts will say, the further you get away from Zimbabwe, the more he's still a hero.
I'm not sure that that's so true. I mean, I was in South Africa a few weeks ago, and there, Mugabe really was the liberation hero. He, defeated the British. It was just extraordinary.
Oh, dear.
But no longer. I mean, and in fact, Mugabe became a cautionary tale for the rest of the continent. There, but for the grace of God, go, this country. And people for many years in South Africa have said, this could become another Zimbabwe as, the specter hanging over the country.
Yeah, full disclosure, we're taping this show as the ANC is picking the successor to Jacob Zuma, and it's a party that's having a hard time reinventing itself. It still has the liberation rhetoric. People at the party Congress call each other comrade, Paul Moreira, but moving to the next generation is proving difficult.
Yeah, I mean, there are some good things about South Africa. I mean, even though, corruption, even though poverty, even though wealth distribution is definitely an issue, but they have achieved to step out of apartheid without too many deaths, without kicking out the bulk of the white population. So they did create the rainbow society that they claimed that they had. But again, I mean, there are huge patches of their towns that are places, the no-go areas, and a level of misery. And I think there's this discrepancy between the rhetoric of the African National Congress pretending to be socialist and all that, and the reality on the ground where they have not redistributed wealth, and I think it's the main problem.
Now, we began this show talking about how Vladimir Putin, if he does have a successor coming up in 6 years' time, is going to make sure he has plenty of guarantees that he's not going to be pursued in the courts. Listen to Jacob Zuma's parting shot at that ANC Congress, where he effectively blamed everyone else for the slipping fortunes of his party and his country, with a particular accent when it came to corruption.
Being black and successful is being made to be synonymous with being corrupt or being corrupt. The ANC must promote black advancement and success and fight attempts aimed at frustrating and undermining black economic empowerment and affirmative action.
So, a translation, if you accuse me of corruption, you're a racist?
Well, yes. I mean, let's say, I think Paul is really right that, it's kind of a miracle that South Africa is what it is today, given its history. However, there really is a serious racial problem that has been, in a sense, sidelined a little bit through the Mandela years, a little bit through the Mbeki years, and it's really kind of come full force now. Most of the country was born after apartheid, what the South Africans like to call the born-free generation. Huh. And the born-frees at this point are the majority of the country. They don't see their government as a liberation movement. They're demanding accountability, like anybody would of their government. And in a sense, the government has, for a very long time, hid behind a sort of liberation, it was all the white minorities' fault. And certainly almost all of it was. But it's a different era now.
It's a different era now, and we're going to see how that develops in 2018. Before we go, it's time to go around the room and ask our panel, what is the Thomais Papaioannou, the one book, the one movie that you would recommend if you want the viewers to arm themselves properly for 2018?
The Post, the film The Post, Steven Spielberg's The Post. It's a new movie. It's coming to theaters, I think, on January. And it's about the Washington Post fight for the Pentagon Papers, to get them out, to get them
Was it 1972?
72, I think, yeah.
Daniel Ellsberg.
Yeah, exactly. And they've risked everything. We can see on the poster Katharine Graham and Ben Bradley, the two leading persons of the journal newspaper.
Excuse me, this sounds like a journalist fantasy, isn't it? Exactly. The publisher is behind you.
Exactly. And I've read the Ben Bradley's autobiography, and it's a fabulous book, and I'm great admirer of Ben Bradley. So I think this film would be great. I think it's very interesting.
Vivian Walt.
Well, if you haven't seen it already, I would say watch the TV series The Handmaid's Tale, which is utterly terrifying. It's not for the faint of heart or stomach, but it's about an America that is truly fascist, shall we say. We're not at that point or anything like it yet, or maybe ever.
It's a cautionary tale in your view?
But I think it's a good series to watch right now as people grapple with really a kind of changed America in the world. and what it might mean for the world. So I think it's stunningly made and absolutely riveting.
Paul Moreira?
I agree with Vivian. It's a great series, but I would pledge for another TV series. It's the second season of The Deuce from David Simon, the author of The Wire, and it's about basically the life around 42nd Street in New York in the 70s, and it's again a nostalgia piece when New York was New York, was not sanitized, and I know the class relationships, the culture struggles, and all that is very well expressed around a very sleazy.
What does that say? That here we are in 2018, and both of you are recommending TV series, American TV series.
That speaks a lot. You know?
It's where the writers are these days.
Exactly.
Craig Kapitas.
I've gone book. Heart of a Dog by Mikhail Bulgakov. It's the story of a professor who transforms a little puppy into a Putin-like character, written in the 30s. One of my favorite books ever, and if you ever have a chance to watch the stage play in Moscow, it contains perhaps the best theatrical line written when the doctor who performs this transformation looks up and says, "My God, what the hell have I done? I've turned a perfectly nice little dog into a son of a bitch."
And we will leave it there for now. I want to thank you, Craig Kapitas, Thalais Papagiannou, Paul Moreira, Vivian Walt. As we say in France, happy end of the year. May all your wishes come true. And then coming on, of course, you can join us again next week for The World This Week.